this loop of very interesting quotes about what some people call the Apollo affair, other people call the NUMEC affair, ranging from the first words of Lyndon B. Johnson all the way through to more recent CIA analysts who have discussed, after a review of relevant declassified information, what they view actually happened in Apollo. So what I'd like to do now that we've run that loop, and I'm not going to go through and explain who all of these people are, since time, even at 2 hours, is quite short. I'd first like to explain the host of this event, the Institute for Research Middle Eastern Policy, which is a private nonprofit organization formed in 2002, incorporated and given tax-exempt status in 2003, which studies US interest groups and lobbies that have the greatest impact on US foreign policy in the Middle East. We study their corporate history, their finance, their affiliations, their activities, their run-ins with the Department of Justice. We also examine secret US policies and accords made affecting the Middle East. And more than engage in extensive declassification processes, we also do action and outreach. We take legal action, we do legal referrals, and put together accountability drives to improve the policy formulation process. IRMEP is the host of tonight's event. There are no other hosts. My background is mainly in corporate research. My undergraduate studies were in international relations, postgraduate in international management. I've worked in over 40 countries, looking at regulatory environments, new market entrants, existing players, supply chain, and corporate strategy, and also have done public policy research as well in such companies as American Express, a Columbian business school, and the Boston-based Yankee Group Research. I'm not here tonight to sell copies of the only book that extensively reviews the Apollo affair. I've already warned several people who contacted me that they might not want to diminish the resale value of their book by having me sign it. And I must warn you that some of the good reviews, such as radio host Jeff Blankford, who said this is a great whodunit that should be made into a movie, I confess he's a friend. A former State Department official, George Kenney, who also has a radio show, called this book on his show, the only person to review it in the early stages, a police blotter. So take your choice. I'm not here to sign or sell the book. However, we are going to do a drawing at the end and distribute 5 copies to people who registered for the event. So if you haven't signed in, please do so, so you can be in the drawing. Why are we studying NUMEC? Why would I come from Washington to talk about NUMEC? We were led into NUMEC because we've been studying for 10 years many of the same organizations, individuals, and law enforcement conflicts that impact what happened here. We've been looking at systemic regulatory failures at the Justice Department, regulatory capture of divisions of Justice Departments that should be enforcing important laws. And we're also very interested in Apollo's role, inadvertent role, in what's called strategic ambiguity and nuclear ambiguity. And I'll explain what that means in a moment, but there are extremely heavy and growing real dollar costs and policy implications that impact an area far greater than the surrounding communities. And so we are today and this week launching a new accountability drive, which will impact the improving situation of freedom of information in the current environment, and also issues of standing in civil suits. Why would we call what happened at NUMEC a cover-up? Well, anybody who's attempted since the 1970s to dig out information from the US government about NUMEC has found a passive cover-up when they go to government agencies, and they find a flood of disinformation continually emitted, which is an active cover-up designed to mislead and misdirect. So I would call this clearly within the gambit or the range of a cover-up. And we've also found in reading virtually every legitimate news report about Apollo and NUMEC and the diversion issue that the media has really fallen down, with certain exceptions locally, I'm proud to say, but has really fallen down in discussing in any degree of detail who formed this organization, what their international and domestic affiliations were, their beliefs, their backgrounds, basic information about how and why this company changed ownership 2 times, what investigators reported in their findings about NUMEC, and most interestingly, what were the executives of this organization saying in private, in wiretaps and surveillance, audio surveillance. You can't start to talk about NUMEC without talking about this brilliant chemist behind me on the screen, Zalman Shapiro, who was a PhD at Johns Hopkins University, a very active leader in the Pittsburgh chapter of the Zionist Organization of America, affiliated with Israel's version of the MIT called Technion Institute, who, while he was still very young, achieved 6 patents for research that he did at Westinghouse. And he's recently filed and won a couple of more for research into manufacturing processes on diamonds. Zalman Shapiro began working on the Nautilus submarine project in 1949, one of the most sophisticated engineering feats to get nuclear propulsion on ships. And he solved many key design flaws with the prototype reactors by putting in enormous hours and inventing entirely new manufacturing processes to overcome inadvertent chemical reactions and make the Nautilus nuclear submarine project a success. Behind the birth of NUMEC, which we'll talk about, was a complex merger, unnecessarily complex, I think, of organizations that provided facilities. NUMEC itself was created in 1956, the very last day of the year, with only $4,500 in capital and 3 directors: Shapiro, Leonard Pepkowitz, who worked on the Manhattan Project very closely with Robert Oppenheimer, and Frederick Forscher, who was the CFO. Backing up NUMEC was Apollo Industries, which merged Santoy Mining Company of Maine, which was involved in mining Mexican mines, American Nut and Bolt Fastening Company, which was making fasteners, and Apollo Steel Company here. In one of the latest or last corporate filings before it was acquired, the total value of this struggling steel plant was $500. It went through several attempts to have employees buy it out as the post-war steel industry fell off a cliff and rescue the town. And I detail in the book the struggle of all 3 of these companies to return to viability before they were merged into Santoy and re-emerged as Apollo Industries. So a very complex merger, and what did it accomplish? It brought together some very interesting people. It brought together Elliot Finkel, who was a corrupt Justice Department official, who, while he was simultaneously engaged in bankruptcy proceedings with faltering steel companies, also was defending them in the same court. He got in trouble for doing that twice and was ultimately eased out of the Justice Department. But we believe he was the one who first identified Apollo as a good investment. Zalman Shapiro was also a director of this facilities company. Executive VP Ivan J. Novick, who rose to become the national president of the Zionist Organization of America, a very tough, outspoken person who, even within the community that supports Israel, was for annexation of conquered territories. He was for all sorts of hardline measures and very vocal about it as the president of the ZOA. And the most interesting person, a mystery man, David Lowenthal, who had an extensive career in smuggling before he came to Apollo. And we're going to get into that in a bit. But why are all of these ZOA connections important? They're important because this is an organization which just 10 years before the formation of Apollo was fighting a bitter battle with the Justice Department. Both the Justice Department and the State Department wanted this organization registered directly as an agent of an organization in Israel called the World Zionist Organization. The Attorney General, however, backed off on the prosecution, which left staffers saying this is a major problem that we're not forcing more transparency on these activist organizations, which communicate internationally and are also, by charter, engaged in special activities for their foreign partners. The 1938 Foreign Agents Registration Act is an Accountability and Openness Act, which is designed, or was designed, to thwart Soviet communists from establishing front organizations in the United States and lobbying and doing PR work. It was effective in shutting down Nazi activity as well. It basically requires that anybody who's acting on behalf of a foreign principal fill out some forms every 6 months, declare their funding, declare their meetings with foreign principals. And then the public can get access to the records and understand what's going on. It doesn't prohibit foreign agency, it just regulates it. The ZOA is also important because before the Apollo affair, this organization was connected to the biggest domestic smuggling network ever created since World War II. This man here, former CEO or chairman of the Zionist organization, Rudolf Sonnenborn, hosted a meeting before Israel was formed with the leader of a government in waiting called David Ben-Gurion, and gathered together major US industrialists who committed to supplying weapons and support toward the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. And they established an archipelago of smuggling fronts all across the United States. Martech, Service Airways, Foundry Associates. They also organized boats to challenge the British blockade and bring displaced persons into Palestine and arm them for the coming fight for citizenship. The most audacious thing they ever did was buy a baby flat-top aircraft carrier from the War Assets Administration and think about sailing it across the ocean and putting it into action. They shipped explosives inside of boilers. They got into trouble in New York when some mislabeled boxes fell onto the piers, exposing that they were actually moving explosives labeled as machinery. And so the FBI became very involved in tracking this organization and uncovering the financing networks. Leonard Slater wrote a book about this in 1970 called The Pledge, which appropriately enough has a box being hoisted onto a ship with weapons of war in it. The FBI felt this was undermining US foreign policy. The Central Intelligence Agency detected the transport of weapons through Europe in aircraft, and it was well documented in a 7,000-page file that's currently at the National Archives. But these fronts, Service Airways, Machinery and Metals Company, had very innocuous names. Some of them were even nonprofits. One of them was in charge of getting a hold of the chaplains list of World War II veterans to try to interest Jewish vets in fighting overseas. Another one of them, Weston Trading Company of Marine Surveyors, was in charge of buying the USS President Warburg and renaming it the Exodus to challenge British blockades. And this is the company that David Lowenthal entered. Once again, major figure in Apollo Industries. David Lowenthal, very interesting character. Now, were there people who wanted prosecutions for all of this smuggling? Yes. One of them, for those of you who do any estate planning, was Norman Dacey, who wrote a book called Avoid Probate, who was a very proactive lawyer who told the Justice Department that he expected them to actually prosecute some of these activities that were disclosed in the book. The Justice Department wrote a book report, passed it to the State Department, which told Dacey he should do legal research and come back once he found out that the statutes hadn't run. In other words, there was no interest in prosecuting, and only a handful of people ever actually did any prison time. David Lowenthal served as a soldier in World War II, and he was recruited into the underground to fight in Israel's War of Independence. He knew the future head of Israeli intelligence personally. He was friends with David Ben-Gurion. There are pictures and FBI files of him, which have not been released. And he broke blockades on the Exodus. This involved a network of various refueling depots. It involved reflagging the ship from Honduras instead of from the United States, forging documents, moving supplies. David Lowenthal's ship was seen off by Rudolf Sonnenborn himself, the master of the smuggling network. And Lowenthal was signed on as a deckhand, learned all of the tricks of the trade. And somehow, by 1958, he had become a leader in Apollo Industries. Now, in his FBI file, which was released in 2010 for the first time, we find out that he was briefed regularly by Israeli intelligence officials long after leaving the fight here in the United States. In particular, he was in key contact with David Carman, a military attaché with the embassy. He lived right next door to Zalman Shapiro, CEO of NUMEC. They didn't have to do much to have private conversations. They both lived on Bartlett Street. David Lowenthal was in Israel during all of the key moments of decision of the country to go nuclear. He would go there to visit ZOA's parent organization, the World Zionist Organization, funded by various charities. He had access to massive amounts of funding for critical missions. Now, there's no paper trail saying that he took any of this money and invested it in Apollo, but he certainly had access to it. This company, this massive company in Apollo, this steel mill, provided all the facilities Zalman Shapiro needed to start a nuclear processing company. Investment, vacant space, shipping and receiving facilities, office space across the street. Lowenthal, who is president of a subsidiary, even occupied the same building as NUMEC when it was getting started. And as many of you know, once it was started, once a flow of government contracts were coming into NUMEC, it wasn't very hard then to get loan guarantees from various regional and state organizations to provide additional capital to NUMEC. What we see is that NUMEC's core value add from a strictly business standpoint was taking in the most precious metal on earth in the 1960s, which was uranium hexafluoride, which people call hex, a gas. This came from gaseous diffusion plants, multi-billion-dollar investments that no other country really had at the time except for the Soviets, and converting it into manufactured uranium dioxide used in nuclear reactors. And they were mainly doing this for the Navy. Its comparative advantage then from the business school perspective was almost exclusively its ability to get government contracts and its personal ties to leaders of the US Navy. It also had a remarkable operation in Lewiston, New York, which it bid on in the early 60s to manufacture boron-10. And it was stunningly efficient and well managed, this boron-10 plant in New York, near Niagara. It had friendly ties in the protection of Glenn Seaborg, who was the head of the Atomic Energy Commission. Zalman Shapiro and Glenn were on first-name basis, so the key regulator was taken care of. It had a captive workforce of out-of-work steel workers who, as we'll see in some wiretaps, they had no compunctions about dismissing on the slightest pretext whenever they were upset. And of course, government-owned nuclear material. This organization, during the time period it was operated by Zalman Shapiro, didn't buy any nuclear material. It would have never been able to afford it. It entered the market at precisely the time when the government was providing free weapons-grade uranium and only charging a nominal fee during the period of time it was converted into a value-added product. And then that window closed, and it was over. Why then Parks and Apollo? Why put up a nuclear facility here? And this is analysis. It was an economically depressed area in strong need of investment. Again, easily dismissed faithful local labor that didn't want to rock the boat. It was remote and out of the way, but had access within a few hours to Zim shipping lines on the piers of New York, which it took advantage of, as well as El Al cargo flights out of Pittsburgh. And it also had the backing of the strongest chapter, which remains today the strongest chapter of the ZOA. So it had a lot going for it, and Parks and Township had a lot going for it when they moved in there as well. The environment that NUMEC was experiencing during this time period was pretty loosey-goosey in terms of safeguards. They did things that they would never allow now. The 1946 McMahon Atomic Energy Act created the regulator, which was hopelessly conflicted in terms of being charged with simultaneously promoting the industry as well as regulating it. So the law permitted private nuclear industry. Atoms for Peace permitted the massive promotion of civilian nuclear power, as well as an effort to reach out to developing countries and provide them with sources for academic study and other access to nuclear materials. A book about the Atomic Energy Commission charges it with essentially failing both of its two core activities, regulation and also safeguards, particularly safeguards. And we'll see this as we advance into the problem of missing material. But the first glimpse of problems at NUMEC were surely that they had files that were, as the Department of Energy mentioned, a mess. Charles Keller probably kept the best notes on NUMEC's operations because he was overseeing the transfer of information the transfer of nuclear materials to NUMEC. So, Charles Keller kept the most intimate diary of what was going on at NUMEC. He recorded at the onset that their files were a mess. This was not the situation at the Lewiston facility. NUMEC was receiving also, he noted, subsidies from the Atomic Energy Commission. They were getting paid for work that hadn't been completed. And in 1963, early in the morning, they had a fire which released 8.8 kilograms of iron uranium into the atmosphere. Now, did they call the local fire department? No. Did they report it to the local press? No. Did the AEC even go out and visit the plant? No. So, reviewing Charles Keller's diaries, which are all at the Library of Congress, you get an idea of the extremely lax oversight of the plant in the early days. Now, the Atomic Energy Commission also wrote formal reports in 1962 saying that the security situation of this converted steel plant was completely unacceptable. They even threatened to cut off their classified weapons work if they continued to be flouting basic security. Now, at the time, weapons work was the Nerva jet engine, a nuclear-powered jet, which, if you Google it, you can see some really interesting video of something you'd never want to see flying over your house. Satellite fuel and Navy fuel for the expanding fleet of surface ships and submarines. The Israeli nuclear program at this particular time, on a parallel track, would have been interested in obtaining weapons-grade U-235 for simple gun-type bombs to fuel their Dimona, their French-built Dimona nuclear reactor, which was under construction. They would have also been interested into all sorts of technologies for triggering and development. So on a parallel track, the Kennedy administration in the early 60s was fighting this Israeli drive to achieve nuclear weapons. The Israelis were out on a spree looking for all the material and technologies they could lay their hands on to advance that program. And on the lobbying side, you had an extremely close relationship between one of the best, biggest, and little-known lobbyists in American history, Abraham Feinberg, and various officials in US government. Abraham Feinberg was the key person to organize Harry S. Truman's whistle-stop tour that saved his election campaign. Those of you who remember the newspaper clippings of Dewey beats Truman during this close election will recall that Harry S. Truman almost didn't get to be president. This is the man who helped organize a funding campaign to get him elected. He was also very close to Glenn Seaborg. As soon as Glenn Seaborg, the AEC commissioner, won a Nobel Prize, this person was in constant contact, inviting him to events, trying to involve him in joint US-Israel nuclear projects. He was a fundraiser for the Weizmann Institute and became chairman in 1971. So on a parallel track, you have extensive lobbying and propaganda funded by Abraham Feinberg. Abraham Feinberg in 1958, according to Avner Cohen, who wrote various books on Israel's nuclear weapons program, was actually named US funding coordinator for the Israeli nuclear weapons program. So he's raising money for US presidents, he's raising money for a foreign nuclear program, he's in close coordination and getting closer to Glenn Seaborg. He's also paying lobbying organizations to wage counter-propaganda. In Justice Department files, you can see a stream of payments he makes to the Near East Report, which is a publication of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, in which high-profile Americans are talking about how Israel could never have a nuclear program. They're sending this to Congress. They're trying to get the administration to get off the trail and not believe that there's a crash program going on overseas. The Weizmann Institute, which Feinberg ultimately became chairman of, now is considered to be the key research organization for the Israeli nuclear weapons program. A Pentagon study sponsored in 1987 documents that Weizmann scientists were way ahead on the curve using laser enrichments needed for nuclear bomb design, advanced methods of tying together supercomputers to do all sorts of simulations of explosions. So this is a very important part of the Israeli program, which is being financed from the United States via the American Committee for the Weizmann Institute. Now, here is one of NUMEC's core competitive advantages. Admiral Hyman Rickover, who is a tough-minded go-getter who single-handedly really put together the American nuclear fleet, was so fond of Zalman Shapiro that even though he begged him to stay, he continued to remain close and reward contracts when Zalman formed NUMEC. But he lost patience with the apathy, as he called it, of NUMEC, and the fact that it was bringing in, within a couple of years, Israeli scientists to work on plutonium projects here in Apollo. He said, pretty much, Zalman, cut it out, get rid of these people. That's not why we're giving you contracts. Not for that purpose. But in this loosey-goosey era of Atoms for Peace, the company was authorized to ship plutonium overseas. And in fact, according to AEC documents, it shipped 320 grams of plutonium, which it rushed to the airport and shipped in a container covered with warning labels. And that was perfectly legal. Plutonium sources, good for academic study of plutonium. Glenn Seaborg was proud as punch because he invented plutonium. That's how he got his Nobel Prize. Was it smart? In 1964 then, the problems began at NUMEC. Westinghouse Astronuclear Lab was giving vast quantities of weapons-grade uranium to NUMEC to manufacture fuel. And NUMEC was reporting so much waste for these processes that they requested almost 3 times the amount originally planned so that they could finish their contracts. It also took on 100% of the responsibility then for this inventory. Once again, it didn't buy it, but it had to pay a monthly leasing fee to have access to all of this uranium. And being the nice regulator that it was, the Atomic Energy Commission even allowed NUMEC to temporarily transfer material from other contracts to convert and ship back to Westinghouse. But this created a vast problem when NUMEC couldn't fulfill its promises. The input was vastly exceeding the output, and so NUMEC started talking about delays of returning the material. It said, no, actually the material went into the waste pits. Oh, it's trapped in filters. We'll get it, we'll get it. Just give us more time. We'll return the nuclear material. The AEC accommodated the delays. Once again, it wanted to see nuclear industry succeed. But then Congress got involved. In 1965, the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy said, what the heck's going on at NUMEC? Why is uranium going in and nothing's coming out? The Atomic Energy Commission quickly launched an emergency meeting on Valentine's Day of 1966 and came up with a theory to explain to Congress about what was going on. Well, they were robbing one contract to pay the other, and all of their losses just accumulated, and suddenly this Ponzi-type bubble broke. But at the same time, the AEC begins to question itself, saying, have monetary fines been enough to prevent uranium from going missing? Is our honors-based system enough for handling this precious military material? Glenn Seaborg, the chair of the AEC, told his staff that it would be desirable to tell Congress that they believed that there was no diversion, that material was simply lost in processing. In papers with his biographer, however, many decades later, he says, gee, I wonder if I was really trying too hard to argue their case. In 1966, the FBI begins investigating Zalman Shapiro. All of these files have mainly been declassified and released. They wanted to know if he was an agent of a foreign government. They wanted to know if he was violating the 1938 Foreign Agents Registration Act. They found out that he was actually a sales agent for Israel through its Ministry of Defense. They found out that he had a joint venture, which only recently becomes clear about what it actually was. But Shapiro told the nice FBI agents, and they said he was a very pleasant person, that he didn't think he was operating as an agent. But the joint venture that was created between NUMEC was with the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission. They both had 50% equity and a $25,000 investment in this joint venture, created just years after NUMEC came into being. Well, what the heck was the Israel Atomic Energy Commission? Shapiro said it was primarily to put together containers with a source that would irradiate fruits and vegetables so that Israel's crops could be exported to the rest of the world. Abner Cohen, however, and many other researchers correctly identify the Israel Atomic Energy Commission as the primary front organization for weapons development. This provided, by sort of mimicking the American Atomic Energy Commission, a front for sending scientists overseas, a front for being able to receive material and claim it was being studied. Oh, we need plutonium because we're academic studying this in our engineering programs, et cetera, et cetera. Now, who were the partners of ISO-RAD, this joint venture? Joseph Ayal, who worked out of the division of the embassy where the LACOM, the Israeli Intelligence and Covert Economic Collection Agency, was hosted. This was formed by Benjamin Blumberg in 1957, a person who Zalman Shapiro told one biographer that he knew and had met many times in Israel. LACOM later ran Jonathan Pollard, this famous Navy spy against the United States. This is who was on the ISO-RAD side. So, NUMEC was a problem. It was losing material. It was engaged in suspicious activity. It had weird joint ventures. The Atomic Energy Commission became even more frightened when the GAO, the Government Accounting Office at that time, began investigating NUMEC, not on behalf of the regulator, but on behalf of Congress, which was worried. The press, as soon as the GAO got involved, started writing its first stories about NUMEC. Now, I already mentioned that most of the early reporting was abysmal. And you can kind of see it in the first two stories from the New York Times. The Paris headline screams, U.S. plant loses 100 kilos of uranium-235. You know, in the Paris edition. In the U.S. edition, it was a little bit more stately. Uranium losses spur drive for tighter U.S. control of fissionable materials. Oh, well, that's nice. What did it mean? Didn't even mention the plant by name, okay? And this has kind of been a recurring problem with reporting, timely reporting. There was even speculation in the U.S. article that maybe if there was a diversion, maybe China's behind it. The AEC then began engineering the sale using its vast regulatory power of NUMEC to a well-capitalized contractor. It knew, and NUMEC knew, that if they paid $1 million fine for all of the lost U-235, they'd go bankrupt. The AEC didn't want to see one of its startups go bankrupt. So it dangled a Hanford contract to Atlantic Richfield. Atlantic Richfield had bid on some lucrative management contracts at the sprawling Hanford site in Washington. But it was not qualified because it was an oil company. So the AEC said, well, if you buy NUMEC, not mentioning any of the diversion problems, which is so good at managing this boron-10 facility at Niagara, no problem, you'll be qualified to acquire or to win this contract. And so in the contracting documents, and we'll get to that in a minute, you can see this quid pro quo. Even the company behind NUMEC providing facilities was a fly speck in the nuclear industry at this time. Most of the players were billion-dollar industries in terms of revenue and net income. NUMEC was tiny. Apollo Industries was similarly tiny. And once the regulations changed and companies would be forced to actually buy nuclear material, it wouldn't have had any value proposition whatsoever. So the AEC forced Atlantic Richfield to, if it wanted to win the Hanford contract, acquire NUMEC. Atlantic Richfield wanted to manage a $270 million chemical facility at Hanford, but it had no handling experience, and only by acquiring NUMEC could it hope to win the contract. During the sale, it transferred all of the liability for management of NUMEC from its incorporation up to the acquisition date, so they were responsible for any cleanup. And they gave $7.4 million in Atlantic Richfield stock to all of the NUMEC shareholders. So it was a sweet deal for 10 years of work. This is language from the contracting document that we got from Hanford. The ability of Atlantic Richfield is considered outstanding because it's not had a previous contract. We can only give it because it's entered the field by acquiring NUMEC, which has done this outstanding job in Niagara. It's satisfactory. Give them the contract. So Atlantic Richfield, a $1.5 billion company, in its 1967 annual report, purchased NUMEC. It's only mentioned as a footnote in that year's annual report, but its first year revenue from the Hanford contract alone was $30.4 million. What a great deal. They had no interest in all of these weird joint ventures. They immediately gave the ISORAD stock back to the Israelis and said, keep it, we're not interested. And it also was a little bit leery of NUMEC. It did not absorb it into its operations, but maintained it as a separate entity. The Central Intelligence Agency, in the meantime, was informing the top official at the Justice Department that they thought HEU had been diverted from Apollo into Dimona. And famously, after Helms, the DCI, the Central Intelligence Director, informs Lyndon Baines Johnson, Johnson tells him, don't tell anybody about this. Keep it under your hat. Don't tell the Secretary of Defense. Don't tell the State Department. Don't tell anybody. And so this, we believe, is an extremely interesting response. But the FBI begins extensive, more extensive electronic and physical surveillance of the CEO of NUMEC. NUMEC was doing strange things even when it was owned by Atlantic Richfield. In 1968, they invited in Avram Ermoni, Bender, Raphael Eitan, all Israeli citizens, saying, we have this engineering group coming into NUMEC. Will you allow them to visit? In reality, with hindsight, we can properly identify the team that visited NUMEC at their invitation under false pretenses. Avram Ermoni was the head of Raphael, the Israeli nuclear bomb coordinator and technical director of Dimona, the nuclear weapons facility. Ephraim Begin was the head of the equivalent of the FBI CIA in Israel. Avram Bender was a Shin Bet operative who was Raphael Eitan's right-hand man on foreign operations, and Rafi Eitan was head of the Lakam espionage network. They all visited the NUMEC plant in 1968. This report to the director of the FBI lists Raphael Eitan as a chemist. Well, he wasn't a chemist. Bender was not an electrical specialist. These are covert operatives, talented ones. Raphael Eitan single-handedly snatched a Nazi war criminal off the streets of Buenos Aires. He was a tough operative, but he was not a scientist. Why was he visiting NUMEC? The FBI also staked out a meeting at Shapiro's home where the head of the nuclear development in Israel got together an economic of friendly industry leaders. When the AEC said, why are you having these meetings? Why aren't these foreign officials going to the Defense Department? Shapiro couldn't answer the question. Shapiro was picked up many times on wiretaps, not all of which have been released. He told the head of PARC, Jack Goldman, the Palo Alto Research Center, that he prioritized Israel over America in 1968. He told Goldman, I'd rather fight for Israel because there's a just cause there. He continually talked about immigrating. He was a dedicated Zionist. In 1969, FBI surveillance picked him up at Pittsburgh Airport meeting with Teruham Kafkafi. The AEC surprised him with an interview. Because Shapiro had held security clearances and had 4,000 classified documents in NUMEC, they had the right to interview him at any time. They brought him in and they said, tell us about all your meeting with Israeli officials. And he said, oh, April, May, anything else? What about last month? What about June? What about June at the Pittsburgh airport? When Shapiro learned he had been entrapped, he quickly said, oh, that was about an outstanding bill for an irradiator. And then later he said, oh, I was visiting my daughter. We met up while I was on my way to another appointment. He couldn't get his story straight. A couple of analysts in a recent article speculate he was probably briefing the Israelis about an upcoming and last inspection of the Dimona plant. They had continually been building fake walls and disguising the plant so that the American inspectors wouldn't know what it really was. That's probably, according to some people, why he was meeting with Israeli intelligence officials in the Pittsburgh airport. Shapiro didn't like working for Atlantic Richfield. He told one Israeli diplomat, he almost told him to go to hell because they wouldn't let him do what he wanted to do. An Israeli government official, though, tried to calm him down. An informant report says they wanted him not to be drastically leaving NUMEC because he was really valuable in his present position at NUMEC and Apollo. Once again, he wanted to go and do business in Israel. ARCO said, no, go to Europe. We want to expand our business there. Constant conflicts. Shapiro was considered to be, after the FBI investigation, an extreme risk because of his combined access to 4,000 classified documents at the plant and also his access to material. So they recommended lifting his security clearances, not letting him have access to material. Here's probably one of the most interesting documents. This was released in 2010 as a result of a request for all FBI files on David Lowenthal. It was a phone call in May of 1969. Shapiro calls David Lowenthal and says, we've had a massive spill. We've been storing 200 drums out of compliance. There's a spill. Oh my God, they're dampening it down to avoid dust and cover it. It looks like rain. But then he suddenly switches into, hey, what's going on with this business acquisition we're working on? And then hangs up. A subsequent call talks about, okay, we're cleaning it up. Actually, we were operating outside of compliance. We had all the drums together. They'll probably corrode through. We didn't put enough fluoride in them, blah, blah, blah. And by the way, if these workers keep complaining, there's going to be a lot of firing. We're going to get new people to clean this up. So kind of an interesting wiretap revealing a private conversation of utter disregard for worker safety. In 1969, the FBI finally admitted it didn't know what David Lowenthal was up to. It called in the CIA and said, can you help us track all of these phone numbers that keep coming into his Pittsburgh home? Could you explain why they get a call and then suddenly rush off on a trip to Israel? Can you track down the people on the other side of these phone calls? And so the FBI got extensively involved. But this was the beginning of the end of the first investigation of NUMEC. It marks the beginning of nuclear ambiguity. Richard Nixon and his extremely talented national security advisor understood what was going on the Israeli side. They said, these Israelis, they are genuinely threatened. They will probably be more likely than any other country to, if they get their hands on nuclear weapons, actually use them if they feel threatened. And we don't really want to be complicit in this. Their secret possession of these weapons, however, would increase the danger in the region. So Nixon advises, or Kissinger advises Nixon, what we really want to do here is not crack down on the Israelis. If we were to withhold something they want, like Phantom jet fighters, they're going to give us all sorts of trouble in the press. They're going to organize a PR campaign that'll make us look like misers. And we won't be able to say why we're withholding them. So let's just pretend that the problem doesn't exist. Let's pretend there is no Israeli nuclear weapons program and prevent it by sticking our heads in the sand from becoming an established international fact. And that is exactly what they did. The winding down, then, of the NUMEC investigation begins. Zalman Shapiro finally resigns from NUMEC. He made some inquiries in Israel. He had almost $3 million in Atlantic Richfield stock in today's terms. What does this nuclear fuel specialist do? Well, he joins Uranium Industries as vice president and requests the top-level security clearances he'll need to gain access to the United States' most advanced hydrogen bomb designs. The Justice Department went through the roof. They said he just went to Kanweki-Barelco, which has the most advanced hydrogen-boosted, beryllium-boosted designs. He's known to be associated with all of these other figures. It would not be in our interest to have him get these security clearances. He was on the FBI's security index, the same index that suspected Soviet spies were on. The FBI noted that, hey, Ermoni is known to be both in technical intelligence gathering in the US, he's also known to be a nuclear weapons development expert, okay? This is Shapiro's friend. We can't have Shapiro in this position. Is there a law enforcement action? No. The Atomic Energy Commission, led by Seaborg, and Seaborg was hands-on in this, and you can read about these in Seaborg's papers at the Library of Congress, decided instead to have Shapiro just swear that he wouldn't do anything bad if he got access to hydrogen bomb designs. The Justice Department didn't like that, neither did the Nixon administration. Both the DOJ and Nixon advised, you know what, don't give Shapiro any more security clearances. The FBI said, well, let's polygraph him. He's already got security clearances. It's within our right. And they said no. So the AEC, once again, exercising its power over the industry, had friends at Westinghouse give him a $40,000 job offering in a position that required no security clearances, back in his old expertise as a fuel specialist. So, excuse me. Second change of ownership. Babcock and Wilcox acquires NUMEC. Atlantic Richfield paid Babcock and Wilcox almost $12 million to take over NUMEC, to take it off its hands, right after it renewed a $130 million contract at Hanford. So you can see why they were even owning NUMEC in the first place. Babcock and Wilcox said, fine. They had to keep up appearances with the US Navy. They had been manufacturing marine boilers since 1916. World War I was a good war for them. But they also had worked on the Nautilus program. So they agree to receive NUMEC in exchange for $12 million and integrate it into their operations. This was another billion-dollar company that in 1971 had massive shipments of mainly government contracted output. So there's your second acquisition of NUMEC. Kind of the closing, kind of the capstone in my book about NUMEC is Glenn Seaborg's last days at the Atomic Energy Commission. Glenn Seaborg, who was so lenient with NUMEC, even though he realized, it seems, what was going on, accepted Abraham Feinberg's invitation, once again, head of the financing system of the Israeli nuclear weapons program, accepted to give the keynote address of the Weizmann Institute's annual dinner at the Waldorf Astoria. And he was paid 10% of his annual salary in an honorarium to give a pre-cleared speech in which he kind of cemented the regulators' view that the strategic ambiguity, nuclear ambiguity, was now the policy of the United States. He said, during my tenure as chairman, I was asked many times if Israel was a nuclear power, and I said, yes, of course. In retrospect, he says, in retrospect, I wish I had said, yes, it's a nuclear power, the kind that knows of and makes use of the atom for peace. You know, oh, really? So nothing happened. That was it. That was the end of the first investigation of NUMEC, Zalman Shapiro, and transfers of weapons-grade uranium. It only reopened in 1977 when, after Congress continually pressured for more information after they did their first GAO report, a presidential assistant by the name of Connors asked for the CIA's file on NUMEC. Said, look, we just want to close this chapter. Just come in, give us a briefing, tell us what happened, and then we'll move on. The head of operations of the CIA, Carl Duckett, went into the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and basically said, it's our consensus as the CIA that nuclear material was used to produce Israel's first atomic bombs. How do we know that? Before Dimona went critical, they had already assembled nuclear weapons. We know that. They were practicing bombing runs that didn't make any sense with conventional weapons. But it doesn't really matter to us. We're not in the law enforcement business. In the report, whether you diverted from NUMEC was academic because plutonium from Dimona was already available. So who cares? What does it matter now? They've already passed the threshold. Of course, another part of the cover-up immediately ensued. The head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission immediately told the CIA head, oh God, if I had known you were going to say that in an open meeting, I would have made sure that there are fewer people in the room. He would have restricted attendance even more. This is Chairman Anders. This is kind of what one journalist, John Fialka, calls the NUMEC self-sealing problem. It always, when it comes out, it starts self-sealing almost immediately. But sloppily, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, upon demand of various environmental groups, accidentally leaked one page from its classified transcript of the meeting. So all of the things I just told you about the bombing runs, the assessment, Dimona, it's academic, is now on the internet as of Tuesday when we put it up there. Now, Attorney General Edward Levy was livid. He said, are you kidding? The Atomic Energy Commission talked the FBI out of enforcing the Atomic Energy Act. There was no serious investigation. You just let the AEC visit it and send 50 people to Apollo. That's it? That's all you did? So they ordered the FBI to reopen the NUMEC investigation now, more than 10 years after the diversion probably occurred, according to them. And they were also charged with investigating, was there a government cover-up? Were government officials like Seaborg actively trying to keep this information from getting out? The National Security Council tasked the CIA to determine whether the material had gone to Dimona. They taught them how to detect the signature of the type of uranium that was sent to NUMEC and how to detect the specific signature of NUMEC material, Portsmouth U-235. Zalman Shapiro, once again, the FBI said, let's just cut to the chase here, folks. Let's hook him up to a polygraph. Let's ask him all these questions that he needs to answer. Why was he meeting? Who was he meeting? Talk about all of these transactions. But Shapiro's legal counsel managed to limit the FBI interview to just his term as president at NUMEC. And of course, his legal counsel said, look, they're only probably pursuing Shapiro because he's such a strong and faithful Zionist, and he doesn't offer any apologies for that. So he gave his second FBI interview. The FBI didn't learn much. The GAO began its second NUMEC investigation. And as part of this, had people from the Department of Energy interview Glenn Seaborg. In Glenn Seaborg's diary, he notes that one day these two gentlemen in 1978, operating on behalf of GAO, walked into his office and told him flat out, you know what? Highly enriched uranium of the type provided to NUMEC was picked up and detected outside of Dimona. And he notes this in his office diary and immediately refuses to discuss the matter with the FBI, never talks about it again, although he continued to defend the position that there had been no diversion. The Central Intelligence Agency didn't cooperate much with the GAO report, made them classify it, even though John Dingell, who had originally asked for the report, said, look, this has got to be public. We've got to account for what happened. We're getting phone calls every day in Congress about this as a diversion matter. But the GAO wasn't able to release it. They only released it to us in 2010, but the CIA still redacted all of their sections. So we have a little bit more than we did in 1978, but not much. The name of the report is Nuclear Diversion in the US, 13 Years of Contradiction and Confusion. It's a very interesting report to read. In 1980, the FBI, after hundreds of interviews, well, 100 interviews, finally got the break it was looking for. It interviewed a NUMEC employee who witnessed Zalman Shapiro and unknown individuals loading U-235 canisters into equipment on the loading dock. They interviewed this person who ran an amominator who wandered out of his workstation, began to smoke on the loading dock, and noticed that U-235 was being loaded in equipment. Now, U-235 is always transferred separately from equipment. Equipment, according to even the Atomic Energy Commission, can't go over broad with nuclear sources inside of it. So this was a revelation. They also interviewed a truck driver who talked about his shipments to New York piers, which would never go into a bonded warehouse. They would always go straight to the ship. The Zim ship would load up the material off. And he said, I never understood why they were so efficient. They would even call the toll booths between Apollo and New York to make sure that he was on time for these shipments. And the truck driver just thought it was remarkably efficient. So the NUMEC neutron pack irradiator is the modern day equivalent, I believe, of boxes of explosives labeled as machinery. And if you take line by line the information given by the NUMEC employee of the canister dimensions stuffed into stovepipes, which were then loaded into equipment, you can come up with about 160 kilos between 65 and 66 being shipped in this single shipment. According to the Department of Energy, in an extensive audit in 2001 where they took all the records they could lay their hands on, they calculated that NUMEC's materials unaccounted for were massive and that the highest losses occurred between 1966 and 1968, not even this earlier period where they were mishandling contracts. That in total, 269 kilograms of U-235 were lost between 57 and 68, and only 76 kilograms lost after 1969 and 1978. Now, the common denominator here is when Zalman Shapiro was actually in charge of the operation. During his reign, they lost about 2% of the U-235. Subsequently, after he moved on, they lost about 0.2%. And this is in spite of the fact that, according to the DOE, total throughput went up. So ARCO and Babcock and Wilcox were handling more material and losing less of it, according to the Department of Energy 2001 audit. And NUMEC, even though it was tiny, won the American record for U-235 losses. Nearly twice the amount of other companies in the same industries, cohort organizations, according to the Energy Department. Now, what you hear from defenders of Zalman Shapiro and NUMEC is that, and Seymour Hersh, who, even though he interviewed Abraham Feinberg, never knew that he was actually the nuclear funding coordinator. Don't know how he missed that. But you hear from Hersh and others in his famous book, The Samson Option, that all of the material was recovered when Babcock and Wilcox took the plant apart. And it's true that 95 kilograms, according to the Energy Department, were recovered. But that wasn't all that was missing. This still leaves, to this day, a balance of 337 kilos, and this is discounting processing losses, sloppy operations, everything. So the outstanding balance is 337 kilograms. And information, I'd like to move now into the part about declassifying NUMEC documents, of which many still need to be declassified. In a small batch of files that were released last week, we know that even as late as 1979, the Carter administration was considering charging Shapiro with obstruction of justice because of his misdirection during FBI interviews, which are actionable in court. They also mentioned that to put together the charging documents, they consulted thousands of pages of CIA reports. Now, none of those CIA files have ever been released, and in fact, until last week, nobody even knew that they were being put to that kind of use. Here's a sample of what was released last week. Obstruction of justice considerations. They took out the CIA-derived documents, which is normal. It's a big red sheet. This happened at the National Archives. Access restricted. Justice Department has to look at this for 5 years before you can get it. What was going on at the same time in the Carter administration? In the same file as the NUMEC file, they were looking at the case of SECO. This was another nuclear processing company that got into trouble and was being considered for criminal prosecution, and they had this big think piece in the file with NUMEC about why they might not want to threaten the civilian nuclear power industry with criminal charges. So you had that going on. And the same timeline as all of these charges were being considered, you also have the Camp David Peace Accords, which was the historic Carter achievement of bringing together Begin and Sadat to end conflicts between Egypt and Israel. So there was no prosecution, obviously. And unlike the Ford to Carter handoff, the Reagan Presidential Library says that they never received any files about NUMEC. They weren't in receipt of this. So the case, the second investigation of NUMEC, dies on the vine, just when you've got eyewitness accounts from people who, back in the 60s, this is an added part of the story, the witness was actually threatened with armed guards to leave the loading dock. He was threatened not to talk about what he had seen, and he was mad by the time he talked to the FBI in 1980 and no longer subject to retaliation. But they didn't do anything with that information. It's fascinating reading, though. The Carter administration documents then disclose a whole new raft of files that they're not releasing. Files that nobody can read except for Justice Department officials. And this is unfortunate. Obama only recently was talking about how Americans don't benefit from ignorance, how we don't benefit from not knowing. But he was talking about the relationship between violent video games and gun violence at schools. But I would say that same thinking can certainly be applied to questions such as suppressing Freedom of Information Act requests. And so all presidents since Nixon have abided by nuclear ambiguity. When Obama was asked by veteran White House reporter Helen Thomas, do you know of any country in the Middle East that possesses nuclear weapons? His famous reply was, I don't want to speculate on that. But what I know is this: if we begin a nuclear arms race, that'll endanger everybody. So he dodged the question. And all presidents have dodged this question, and few have been brave enough to ask it. There are many obstacles, though, to declassifying documents in this domain in particular. Timothy Naftali, a historian who was on C-SPAN just a couple of weeks ago, was talking about his new work about the Nixon administration. He's got a fascinating new book out. And he said, even as the chief archivist, I could not get access to information because people surrounding these institutions want to preserve the legacy of the period. They're not interested in dragging skeletons out of the closet. And so that's a problem. The biggest problem, though, is the CIA, which doesn't consider this to be more than an academic concern, and so it won't release its documents, and our nuclear ambiguity, strategic ambiguity policy. Now, there are some new declassification tools that we've been able to avail ourselves of. President Obama wrote a memo in 2009 saying that we should presume as government agencies an atmosphere of openness, a presumption in favor of disclosure. And I can attest, as somebody who's been filing Freedom of Information Act requests for 10 years, that that actually has had a major impact. It gives new Freedom of Information Act officials within these agencies the power to release stuff that they didn't release before. So we have that. He also issued a directive, an executive order, 1326, saying no information can remain classified indefinitely, and that all documents should normally be expected to, if they're classified as secret, the classification should expire within a quarter century. So this essentially puts all of the documents that will really tell the foreign end of the NUMEC story way overdue for release. There's another major tool that we in particular have been applying to this case called mandatory declassification. Normally, a journalist who files a Freedom of Information Act request, if they deny it, you have to take the agency to court and sue them. And courts don't like overturning agency decisions, and it's costly, and nobody wins these cases with few exceptions. Well, if you know a document exists, you can do another thing called file a mandatory declassification review, in which you say, I know this document exists, declassify it, and if they refuse, you can appeal the refusal. And if they refuse you a second time, you can go to a special outside panel and say, look, they won't give me these secret documents. Why don't you review their rationale? And this panel will receive the information and make its own decision. And in 60% of the cases over the last decade, they've reversed agency decisions about classification. And so the ISCAP panel is extremely cumbersome to get to. You have to file all of these requests and appeals, you have to know what you're looking for, et cetera, et cetera. But once they get it, they will convene top agency officials and overrule each other and make good decisions. I can say that after reviewing archives that I've never seen anybody using just the Freedom of Information Act process, not the MDR or ISCAP process, never seen anyone actually sue the government for these documents. And no party has ever gotten any of these documents into the ISCAP pipeline until now. These are some documents that are currently in a declassification pipeline. Spymaster Raphael Eaton's file with the FBI. He was, again, this key operative behind Pollard and who visited NUMEC. His right-hand men. National Security Council files on their response to NUMEC and the rest of the Israeli nuclear weapons program. Thousands of files that exist, but we don't know what folders they're in. So this is just a FOIA. The DOJ's assessment of Carter administration CIA documents for prosecution. Found out about that last week. We're now asking for those files specifically. The ISCAP panel, again, this super panel that overrules executive decisions, has an entire bailiwick of NUMEC-related files that it has to consider and decide on relatively soon. David Lowenthal's FBI file is 75% CIA information gathered overseas, because that's where he spent most of his time, even though he was, running Apollo Industries. So his entire CIA file, which may show the other side of the smuggling network, is now under declassification review. The Carter administration's National Security Agency file on NUMEC is now in front of the ISCAP panel. The folder with hundreds of documents has the ominous title of Proliferation, Apollo, Pennsylvania, 77 through 79. The NSA is in the ELINT business, electronic wiretaps, phone intercepts. So whatever they have is likely to also reveal the foreign side of the smuggling network. The first warning discussions. Remember when LBJ said, "Oh my God, possible diversion from Apollo, don't tell anybody." We know what's in those memos because they're cross-referenced in so many other government files. But the actual memos have never been released. But they may soon be. Avraham Ermoni's file and the entire Nuclear Regulatory Commission notes of the CIA briefing that they received in 1977 saying, oh, yeah, there was a diversion. So all of these things are in a new pipeline for consideration of release. But they're not going to be released unless there's a little bit more, I think, public pressure to actually get them out. The organizations that were originally involved behind the scenes with public relations and lobbying and moving money around and enabling the network, who we feel never faced accountability, are still out there. In fact, the Weizmann Institute has overlapping directors with the top Israel lobbying group in the United States, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. They're highlighted in conferences. This is still clubby and cozy, and everyone's feeling nice, and nobody's accountable, and the money still flows. The FBI reports on Weizmann under this new Freedom of Information environment, however, keep coming out. It was actually detected intruding on Army computer systems in the 90s. The FBI's counterintelligence has already assessed that this organization raising funding in the United States is involved in nuclear weapons development. Charitable activity? I don't think so. So there are new perspectives also coming out in the press about Weizmann, this key financing, which are very interesting in its role in helping incubate the nuclear weapons program. So there's a stream of documents that can come out. new information that hasn't ever been revealed. The top shelf stuff in terms of really providing final analysis of what happened. There are also some extremely valiant lawsuits, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, that have been filed in the Western Pennsylvania district courts of individuals who have been trying to seek wrongful death damages from the companies that acquired NUMEC, Atlantic Richfield, Babcock and Wilcox, their insurance companies. And what's interesting from our perspective as researchers is not the fact that aggrieved individuals have finally almost gotten before trials in the court system, but who's fighting them back. These individuals with legitimate grievances and limited resources are going up against one of the biggest law firms in Washington, D.C., Arnold and Porter, LLP. What's interesting about Arnold and Porter is who they work for. Even though it's not a defendant, it's going to want to be involved in all NUMEC cases and has been for a long time. The other issue which is interesting about the current lawsuits is that both parties assume that NUMEC was an entirely legitimate operation, despite this rather sordid history. And so to the extent that more and more information comes out revealing this to be a less than legitimate organization, that could harm these plaintiff suits, since liability policies generally don't cover criminal activities, knowing premeditated criminal activities. So we think that these are valiant lawsuits currently in this court system, but that they've got some pretty big problems. Who are they fighting? Well, they're not really fighting Atlantic Richfield or Babcock and Wilcox. The firm that's defending against these suits is the longest running Israeli foreign agent law firm in the United States. They've been working for the Israeli government since 1967. They receive a $10,000 monthly retainer from the Israeli government for special projects, a slush fund. When Zalman Shapiro had to testify for the GAO report in '78, they prepared him for the testimony. They have defended Israeli officials against war crimes charges in US courts, and they've won every case. They have assisted in the rehabilitation of Shapiro's reputation, and they're the ones who are on the other side of these suits. They have been, after these wins, paid $500,000 in 2008 alone for successfully defending lawsuits in the United States. They represented Zalman Shapiro in an important bid for the rehabilitation of his reputation in 2009. They prepared his application to win a presidential level award for technological innovation, which he was well qualified for. He gave us the Nautilus nuclear submarine. In 2010, they were simultaneously paid $1.2 million in Israeli government fees for services. What happened with that bid to restore Zalman Shapiro's reputation? The biggest law firm representing Israeli interests in the US and Zalman Shapiro lost. They wanted an unequivocal statement from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that Shapiro had never been involved in diversion, that he was a loyal citizen. They wanted that Nuclear Regulatory Commission statement put in his FBI file as well. Prepared by Arnold and Porter, they got this man, Arlen Specter, to submit it to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in 2009. He wrote Rebecca Schmidt saying, "We want you to issue this formal public statement that he was never involved in uranium diversions. We want that, in a month. So let's get it going." To its credit, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, in a bland statement, said, "We don't have enough information to say that there was never material diverted from the site. We do know that it would have never been detected. And behind the scenes, citizen petitions were flowing into the Presidential Commission, which selected finalists, saying quietly, if you're going to award Shapiro the top technological innovation awards in a presidential ceremony, you better release all of these government files and all of the secrets about what happened at NUMEC. Otherwise, there's going to be controversy. I think the combination of these two actions, citizen petitions and saying there was no cause, overturned this bid. Arnold and Porter lost. I think the document declassifications that are currently underway in ISCAP could impact the local cleanup, and most of you are probably more expert in that than I am. But what is obvious is that all of these secrets that are still bottled up contain useful information. As far as we know, the FBI wiretap that was released about illegal storage bill, nobody knew about that until the FBI released it. And so what we've seen is that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is interested in receiving that kind of information. They have received it. They've convened secret meetings in Washington with agencies that usually are toxic cleanups, like the CIA, FBI, Department of Homeland Security. And even though they haven't said what those meetings were about, they probably, in our view, were about the secret past, which is slowly coming into the public domain. I also think that to the extent NUMEC is considered a diversion site, a crime scene, rather than mainly a cleanup, that American taxpayers who follow this come to resent it. Resent being stuck with the bill. This dead fish of secrecy is wrapped in a soiled newspaper called nuclear ambiguity. So to get to NUMEC documents, you have to pierce that veil of unaccountability. Again, the 1971 deal generally impacts agencies because they don't want to declassify anything that would tend to reveal the U.S. knows so much about the Israeli nuclear weapons program. So the U.S. doesn't want to discuss the nuclear arsenal. Obama did, at the beginning of his administration, say that he wanted to see them in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But at any rate, the deal was this. The 1971 deal was Israel wouldn't test, sell, proliferate, declare nuclear weapons, and the U.S. would stick its head in the sand. And U.S. presidents have generally abided by their end of the deal. Carter spilled the beans once he left office saying, oh, you know what, they have 150 nukes, he told a news agency, BBC, I think. But nobody paid any attention. Israel, on the other hand, has violated its end. It was detected testing with apartheid South Africa some weapons in the ocean. And apparently, Shimon Peres even offered, according to Sasha Polakau-Saransky, a Council on Foreign Relations scholar, offered to sell some of its nuclear-tipped Jerichos to apartheid South Africa. That came out in 2010. So there are a lot of drawbacks to the U.S. for pretending that Israel doesn't have nuclear weapons, and one of them is it staunches the flow of documents about NUMEC. It also promulgates a false debate. Now, every night when we go home and flip on Fox News or NPR, we hear about the threat of Iranian nuclear weapons. We rarely receive any context about the fact that there's another party in the region that already has a massive deployed arsenal. Nuclear coercion, that's a problem when one party has nuclear weapons and can coerce the United States into providing aid or threatening to go nuclear. So there are a lot of downsides to preserving nuclear ambiguity, including third-party pursuit of damage claims. It would probably be easier to pursue damage claims if we didn't have this wall of nuclear ambiguity still up after so many decades. Breaking down this wall involves challenging many different parties who don't want to see the wall taken down, and will fight it, will leak information. It may tie into other cover-ups that we don't know about. The federal government will look bad. There are also aid restrictions. The Symington and Glenn amendments say that the US can't provide aid to any foreign country with a nuclear arsenal outside the NNPT without a waiver. So breaking down the wall of nuclear ambiguity to get more accountability is a tough slog. But it would have some positive repercussions as well. It might even lead to regional peace. Even in the 1960s, in national intelligence estimates, the CIA said that if Israel did go nuclear, it would be less inclined to make concessions toward peace. It would become more secure and self-confident, and we'd never get them to get out of occupied territories. That's not entirely true, but that was their assessment in the 1960s. So taking down strategic ambiguity could actually lead to peace. It might also offer kind of a new pot of money for cleaning up. It might take defense dollars, which are predicated on the idea of defending a country that's in an emergency situation, being threatened by all of its neighbors. It might start diminishing that fear, which is leading to $3 billion worth of foreign aid every year. It would mean we could stop pretending that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty isn't in jeopardy, this treaty designed to limit the spread of nuclear weapons. And it might even increase accountability in other areas of government. So there's an incredible opportunity, I think, in tying a drive to get more accountability on NUMEC to the larger drive of overturning nuclear ambiguity. In the 1940s and 50s, all of the smuggling organizations were either scared by criminal investigations or folded into Israeli government official legitimate organizations for the purchase of weapons and materials. They went legit. In the nuclear smuggling field, a different story has unfolded. The case of Milco of California is one case. This is a case in which a front company, which had the Ministry of Defense in Israel behind it, was smuggling all sorts of restricted weapons and nuclear triggers out of the United States in the 1970s. The CEO was criminally prosecuted. It was shut down. Telegy, which was shipping Textronics oscillators overseas to Israel for weapons development. Detected, shut down in 2010. You didn't hear about it, quiet action to take it out. So NUMEC is different than these smuggling fronts because there's never been any accountability. Nothing's changed. In terms of getting change, it's important to know who's going to be for it and who's going to be against it. There are some pretty powerful interests, including politicians who love feeding at the Israel lobbying gravy train for campaign contributions who aren't going to want to tackle it. The Israeli government and their little helpers, Arnold and Porter, the CIA, which likes secrecy because it likes secrecy. There are organizations which are probably just indifferent. They're tired of it. They don't want to deal with it anymore. But there are also lots of organizations that are interested in clearing up glaring accountability issues. They don't have any money, but there are a lot of people. So what would accountability look like? What would real accountability look like? Well, get some of these environmental and civil damage claims paid for by the government behind the smuggling front, perhaps deducted from foreign aid allocations. It would look like getting all of these documents out in the open. That would be accountability. What would accountability on this bigger fish wrap look like? The strategic ambiguity, nuclear ambiguity. Dropping it as a US policy would force agencies to discuss the reality of proliferation. It would enable a more informed American debate. Oh, There are countries in the Middle East with nuclear weapons. But the challenge is finding the right vehicle, I think. And there is no right vehicle right now. There is no movement armed with this knowledge tackling the problem. We're trying to build that movement. There's a new registration drive designed to put together lawyers, legal research, information, publicizing the declassification drive, explaining why it's important, providing updates about lawsuits, letting people participate in projects. It's called endambiguity.com. Just like many of you signed up to come here tonight, it's basically sign up on the web, receive a flow of information, participate to the extent that you're able. We think that getting more people to see the value in releasing all of this information at both levels is extremely important. Now, I'll end and hopefully take some questions with this idea. The first reaction to the possible diversion was LBJ saying, let's keep it a secret. So it would be entirely appropriate to begin breaking down the entire decrepit infrastructure of ambiguity from the place it began. And I would be personally very gratified if some of you choose to join us in our campaign for full declassification and full accountability. And so with that, be excited to take your questions.